The Lord of Darkness by Shelby Cotty Sweeney. Part 2, The Beginning of the World. Chapter 3, The Mark of Cain. Eve's tribe was nomadic, but not all humans were at the time. When she came across Eden Village in 9499 BC, her first instinct was to avoid the altered ground. But, as with many humans, her curiosity won out. She looked at the circular huts made of brick and mud inquisitively. It was getting dark, so she stumbled slightly on a hoe. Eve stared at it, wondering what sort of game they hunted with such a weapon. Eve skirted the light of the campfire, where the villagers were sharing a lamb and lentil stew, while one of them spoke with emphatic tones and gestures. She didn't know the language, but she could tell it was a well-worn story of excitement and adventure from the way the audience's eyes shone moments before the storyteller's voice reached a crescendo. Eve became mesmerized by the tempo of the tale, the crackle of the fire, and the unitedness of the villagers. She was overwhelmed by homesickness for the family that had wandered or died off over the years, leaving Eve alone. Except for the angels, but they hadn't visited in several moons. Not since that day when Nick looked into her eyes so deeply and told her something so important and then was snatched away somehow. Eve tried to avoid thinking about Nick the same way she avoided thinking about her family, and she mostly succeeded as she focused on the all-vital task of finding food. The sadness, grief, and anger boiled inside her like poisonous tar. One day, Eve would let it all out. She would sob for days and lay in her straw mat bed for more days. She'd barely eat, barely wake. It would happen after the day, that most tragic day in Eve's life when one son died and the other vanished, that Eve would crumble, unable to cope anymore. She'd cry for Abel and for Cain. She'd cry for Nick, whom she'd assume was lost to her forever. She'd cry for her family, the parents and siblings lost long ago, and the family she'd made herself, which would seem ruptured beyond repair. Fortunately, it was customary for people in that place and time to grieve in such a manner, so Eve would be given time to heal, and eventually she'd emerge from her hut with a kind of strength she hadn't had before. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Eve was so entranced by the ambiance and the alluring nostalgia I brought that she forgot to mind her surroundings. One of the villagers shifted, sending firelight streaming onto Eve, who found herself in a sheer panic, unable to move. She'd defended herself against mightier predators and warriors than these, but for so many reasons she couldn't yet grasp, these people left her momentarily paralyzed. One of the men in the group said something to Eve in that same language she didn't understand. He held out a chunk of lamb towards her, which she very much understood. Eve wasn't starving, but she was severely lacking protein. She tore into the meat ravenously, barely noticing the pleasantly flavorful taste of rudimentary spices. The man's name was Adam. He was objectively handsome, with a strong jawline and sculpted muscles. He had black wavy hair, perpetually suntanned skin, and light brown eyes. Eden Village didn't have a designated leader as such, but Adam was essentially in charge. In addition to being capable, hardworking, and charismatic, he had relayed everything I told him to the other villagers, essentially founding humanity's first major religion. The information was fairly basic. I told him God was an all-knowing, all-powerful entity who created people, the world, the sun, the stars, everything. I told him God loves all their creations. I told him I'm an angel, a messenger of God. And I told him there's an existence beyond what humans call life. Adam watched the newcomer with interest. This was the perfect opportunity to demonstrate charity to his fellow villagers. While he was looking, he couldn't help noticing she was quite beautiful. He gestured between her and the pot of stew, a clear invitation. No one else objected, so Eve warily crept forward and accepted the food gratefully. The villagers were careful not to stare at her. They were more than a little curious about the stranger, but they understood hunger and let her eat in peace. "I don't believe she understands what we're saying," Adam said. "What if she's dangerous?" asked one of the villagers. "She doesn't appear to have weapons," reasoned Adam. He looked at the group seriously and said, "She's hungry and we have food to spare. God wants us to feed her." The villagers nodded reluctantly. In those days, humans in stationary villages rarely married for love. They married for practical alliances. Adam was strong, physically, mentally, and spiritually. He could provide food, comfort, and safety. And he was kind. Eve would have been crazy to not want to marry him. Eve was beautiful and intelligent, but she had to be taught many skills the villagers took for granted. like how to farm and how to behave appropriately in a stationary village. She didn't have a dowry and was older than the average bride, unlike his first wife, Lilith, who died years earlier. So why did Adam want to marry Eve? He was attracted to her, certainly, and she was attracted to him. But also, he was plagued by the special type of loneliness that comes from experiencing something massive that other people haven't. And Eve experienced it too. As the intuitive people they were, how could they not believe they were meant to be together? I wonder now if we inadvertently created a paradox when we decided to talk to both before they met each other. I talked to each of them because we knew they'd marry one day. But did they marry because they shared the experience of having talked to an angel? It's probably fine. It probably would have happened anyway. Marriage was basically the same in Eden Village as what you're used to. Adam proposed to Eve and she accepted. They formed a marriage contract, and then they had a wedding ceremony and celebration. Of course, generally the proposal and marriage contract were made between the groom and father-in-law-to-be, but Eve had no living family and no property or wealth. Adam and Eve loved each other. Not the way Nick and Eve loved each other, but it was love of a sort. Specifically, it was a fragile sort of love, and it wouldn't survive the tragedy that would befall them. Abel's murder would shatter what they had, and the pieces would never fit back together again. They wouldn't realize it at first. Their grief would encompass too much. And when they did realize it, it wouldn't matter enough. Divorce occurred in those days, but neither one would want a different lifestyle. They'd still care for each other, obviously, and would reach an unspoken understanding and live out the rest of their lives in relative contentment. But they wouldn't get back together when they reunited in heaven. They simply weren't each other's soulmates. Adam met his soulmate in heaven. Have you ever heard a human say it's Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve? Well, we all get a big laugh out of that because it's actually both. Shortly after Steve died, he and Adam met in heaven and really hit it off. They were married in a field of rose petals under an evening sky bursting with shooting stars. When you die, you'll find yourself lying down with your eyes closed. You'll be suspended in a gray void, but feel like you're lying in your own bed, or your approximation of one. We've tried it many ways, and starting with the sense that you're waking from a dream is the least jarring. Then you'll be greeted by a reaper, a demon or an angel, depending on where you're headed. The reaper will help you come to terms with your demise, then escort you to group orientation in your next plane of existence. On the day Eve's second son died, Nick was there to greet him. Usually he delegates mundane tasks, but he took a break from his regularly scheduled hell-raising to reap Abel's soul. Despite being notoriously lax with his reaper's dress code, Nick wore the traditional reaper uniform, a long black hooded robe with accompanying scythe. Abel was wearing the simple tan tunic he died in, except it was softer and completely clean. Nick set aside his scythe, lowered his hood, and knelt beside the unconscious human. He stared intently at the boy who was the closest he'd come to Eve in almost 22 years. Nick also couldn't help noticing that Abel didn't look too much younger than 22 himself, which meant that not much time passed between Eve losing Nick and finding Adam. Nick knew it shouldn't bother him, but it did. Abel sat up with a gasp. It happens with humans who die suddenly and unexpectedly. "You're fine," Nick said gently. "You're fine. Everything's fine now. It's okay. You're okay." Abel dropped his head onto Nick's shoulder and wept heavily and uncontrollably. Nick stroked his hair and repeated things like, "Everything's okay now," and let it all out. Comforting the recently deceased came with the territory, and although he hadn't reaped in ages, Nick fell into the motions impulsively. His hands shook and his heart ached, and he felt like crying himself, but he didn't. After Abel cried out all his tears and sat upright, Nick asked him, "Do you understand where you are and how you got here?" Also standard procedure. A person who quickly comes to terms with the reality of their death tends to better adapt to the afterlife than one who doesn't, so it's a good way to gauge how difficult a reaping will be. Abel's brow furrowed as he tried to remember. I was in the fields with Cain. We were arguing, and I said something, and he got very angry. Nick's stomach tightened into knots. He hadn't read the report. He rushed straight here, so he didn't know how Eve's second son had perished. Abel had had a fight with his older brother Cain in the wheat field. Cain picked up a rock, hit him hard on the back of the head, and watched him crumple lifelessly to the ground. And then Abel woke up here. I'm dead, Abel realized. With a brand new life ahead of you, Nick added with forced cheerfulness. I'm only 17, said the stunned human. The seraph sighed heavily. I know, it's not fair, but you're safe now, I promise. I was supposed to die old, surrounded by family, Abel continued. I never even kissed a girl. I can help with that, Nick offered enthusiastically. There are plenty of girls in heaven and hell. Not a lot of humans yet, but they'll get there, and you'll get there. You got infinite time to do all sorts of stuff. Are you an angel? Abel asked. Nick grinned. How'd you know? Archangel Nichael of Penance and Faith, at your service. Call me Nick. My dad talked to angels, said Abel. Dad said they're made of light? Nick wavered his hand to indicate sort of. We convert ourselves to matter or energy at will, so we travel a lot as light waves. Sorry, too advanced. We're made of light when we want to be, and sometimes we're made of other stuff. What else do you know? Dad talked to an angel named Gabriel, and... You okay? What? Replied Nick, blinking away slight disorientation. People rarely tried to talk to him about Eve, so the perception skips hadn't come up much. I was talking about... Abel said. You did it again. The truth is, I can't really hear about your mom anymore, Nick told him. Trying to ignore his budding headache, he asked, Did you hear that last bit? Yeah, you said you can't anymore, repeated Abel. Good, sounds like a yes, Nick deduced. I can't perceive her or information about her. When she dies, she won't be able to perceive me either. Sorry if I'm talking weird. I'm only hearing part of what I'm saying, and it's real jarring. Basically, I'm the other angel your mom talked to. I wasn't supposed to do that, and I really wasn't supposed to tell her most of what I told her. It was a tiny bit catastrophic. How is she, by the way? Sorry, never mind, you can't actually tell me, but how are you, generally? I mean, before the end, how was your life? Were you happy? More or less, said Abel, but more or less? More, I guess? Nick sighed with relief. Great, that's great to hear. How's your, You were going to ask how my brother is? Abel guessed. Nick blushed. The human's eyes widened excitedly, and he asked, Can I see? What? Asked the startled archangel. Can I see what Cain's doing right now? Abel asked eagerly. Best not, Nick told him. Believe me, I've done this a few times before, and you don't want to see. Not yet. Oh, replied Abel. So what now? You take me to heaven? Nick grimaced. No. Sorry, not yet. You'll go, just not yet. I'm going to hell? Abel deduced crestfallen. Just for a little bit, Archangel Nick of Penance assured him. What did I do wrong? Abel asked. Well, let's see, Nick said, opening the file and scrolling through it. You were prideful. You antagonized your brother constantly, which doesn't justify his actions, but that doesn't justify your actions. You raised livestock to support yourself and your family and village, but never considered helping outsiders. You're not that far off. We'll get you there before you know it. It was a good thing they didn't check on Cain at that moment, because Lucifer was haunting him. Haunting the living is allowed under a few strict conditions. We can only tell them things they could reasonably have discovered or imagined on their own. We can't cause any lasting physical harm. We can't alter God's plan, and the haunted can't be able to prove that any of it happened. Obviously, as humans got better at proving things, we had to scale back hauntings. It became a bit of a tradition to haunt the first murderer in the Judgment Age. That is, the first to commit murder when it counted against them in the afterlife. We'd make the wind whisper the name of the murder victim, or set a few bushes ablaze, or make them see their victim's face in their reflection for a few weeks, or have a flock of birds follow them around. Just little pranks. Everyone who was interested drew lots before the Soul Age to see who'd get the honor. I didn't participate, but ironically, Nick did. In retrospect, I wish he'd won and Lucifer hadn't. Cain wandered haphazardly through the woods in a frantic daze. He didn't know how long he'd been running or where he was, but he hadn't yet reached the point where those facts bothered him. When his face wasn't racked with guilt and panic, Cain was handsome, only slightly less handsome than Abel. Cain's features were rougher, his brown hair was stringier, his dark brown eyes were duller. He was a wheat farmer, an important job that required countless hours of strenuous labor. Meanwhile, Abel was a shepherd, a prestigious job that supplied Eden with coveted protein. On top of all that, Abel was inherently more likable than Cain. Cain felt like he lived in the shadow of his younger brother, which was the main reason they constantly fought. While Cain ran wildly through the forest, his thoughts ran rampant too. It was a dream. No, Abel was dead. He was dead and Cain killed him. He didn't mean to, did he? "Hey, Cain!" Archdemon Lucifer of Pride called out audibly but invisibly. Cain stopped in his tracks and looked around wildly. "Who goes there? Show yourself!" "Where's your brother, Cain?" asked Lucifer. "How should I know?" Cain retorted, still searching for the source of the voice. "I'm not his keeper." "What did you do to Abel?" Lucifer continued more angrily. I didn't." "What did you do, Cain?" the archdemon shouted. Cain fell to his knees, crying hot tears. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "You did," Lucifer said. "I can't face my parents," Cain realized. "Your fields are stained with your brother's blood," Lucifer proclaimed. "No plants will grow there. If you eat any animal from these woods, its flesh will taste like Abel's." "Oh God, have mercy," begged Cain. "I'd rather you smite me now." "Which brings me to my final curse," said Lucifer with a wicked grin on his scarless face. Lucifer slashed at Cain, quick as a whip. The human staggered back with a strangled yell. When Cain lowered his hands from his throbbing face, Lucifer could see a dark red gash connecting Cain's right eyebrow to the left of his chin and misaligning his features. There were nicer ways to do it, but Lucifer had injected him with a culture of organisms whose life cycles centered around repairing damaged cells and tissues. They don't have any negative side effects like cancer or anything either, so they instantly create a symbiotic relationship with nearly every living creature. Interestingly, they avoid repairing any damage that exists before they complete their 12-hour incubation period, so the wound would be Cain's only scar that never healed. "You've been marked," Lucifer told him. "You'll live a long, healthy life, and if anyone kills you, 7 of them will die." Then Lucifer left in a flash of light. The last part of his pronouncement was not true. It was a story to scare humans away from wanting to kill him. Because for Cain, living a long life would be torture. You see, Cain knew we were all real. God, heaven, hell, angels, demons, because his parents had talked to us. He didn't doubt it at all, so he understood what happened that day, more or less. He mistook Lucifer for God, but he got the salient points. Cain understood that he would live a long, tortured life spent silently screaming, and he felt he deserved it. He was left alone in a forest, in a fog of horror, with no clue how to get back home or what he would say when he got there. Later, when Nick found out what Lucifer did, he went to the archdemon's office and closed the door behind himself. He didn't speak a word, but his shirt said, "I am their keeper." He swept towards Lucifer in a quiet rage. Quick as lightning, Nick scratched a deep rivet into Lucifer's face, from his right eyebrow to the left of his chin, deep and thick enough that the bottom half of his face stopped lining up with the top, exactly like Cain's. Nick turned and strode out as furiously and silently as he'd come. As soon as the door closed behind him, Nick was instantly teleported to the blue void. God had manifested as Nick again. Nick withered under their glare. "How dare you?" God demanded. "How dare you harm a fellow Celestial? You have yet to even begin penance for your last sin, and here you are sinning again. Explain yourself." I didn't think," Nick stammered. "I'm sorry." "Are you?" countered God. Nick was about to say yes, but caught himself. "If I didn't do it, would my other siblings keep tormenting Eve's family?" "If you refrain from scarring Lucifer, your family lacks a deterrent against retaliating against hers," God answered vaguely. "Then I don't know if I regret it," Nick admitted. The Almighty sighed with exasperation. "How are you still so blind to the repercussions of your actions?" "You made me this way," Nick pointed out. "You became this way," they corrected. "Semantics. You're omnipotent and omniscient," Nick argued. "So you tell me, how am I so blind to the repercussions of my actions?" God explained. Thus far, I have shielded you from facing them directly. That is why I am not assigning you penance for your latest sin. What now? You heard me, they said. On this occasion, I will not allow you the opportunity to set things right. Millennia from now, you will face the formidable repercussions of your actions today. Then you may decide if it was worth it. Nick was speechless. He couldn't wrap his head around the concept. No penance? But he'd just committed the most heinous act of seraph-on-seraph violence in the history of the multiverse. How could he cope without setting things right? Everything suddenly seemed askew. He almost lost his balance. What'll happen to me? You will not be forgiven, God told him frankly. Nick had never felt so lost.